can,
The roll is, right?
or they can up, down on the arrow key, yeah, where they can.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Water Quality Committee meeting. Let me check and see if we have any commissioners on by phone. Speak up, please. Commissioner Carter, Commissioner Davis. I know Commissioner Davis told me she was planning to.
I'm here.
WebEx. Hello. Commissioner Carter, are you on WebEx? Here. Well, our meeting is also being broadcast over WebEx. And there are addresses available on the EMC meeting website for meetings. The members who are participating are categorized as panelists, and they will be able to talk with the meeting members here.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
this is Charlie Carter. I was muted when you asked before, but I am here.
Great. Glad to know that you both are here. I don't believe we're expecting Commissioner Gillespie. And again, Commissioner McAdams in the meeting room, as well as Commissioner Martis, Vice Chair Harris. We have Division Director here in our council. Calling this meeting to order, North Carolina General Statute 163A-159E mandates that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the EMC's Water Quality Committee. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict, please state so at this time. Record can show that there are no turns voiced. Proceed with approval of our May 12, 2021 meeting minutes. And Commissioners Carter and Davis, if you have difficulty hearing me, please let me know if I need to speak closer to the microphone. You have the meeting minutes before you. Vice Chair Harris had a suggestion for adjusting the sentence so that it reads less awkwardly. Would you like to make that?
Madam Chairman, it's on page 2 in the 5th paragraph, last sentence. There's a very awkward sentence, so would like to propose that we change that, and I'll read it with the changes. I'm just going to go straight to that last sentence. He also acknowledged that DWR has proposed a site-specific standard that tries to balance the overall long-term conditions in high rock lake with short-term problems that may arise in backwaters and coasts. So I went ahead and took out all the extra words. So if that change is acceptable, I'd like to move that we approve the minutes with that change.
Thank you, and we can provide a markup for the division staff. Do I have a second on the meeting minute motion?
I'll second John McAdams.
Thank you. Any other discussion about minutes? Any other notes taken about it? If none, all in favor of approving and submitted, please say aye. Oh, I'll do a roll call. Commissioner Carter,
Aye.
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner McAdams,
Aye.
Commissioner Martis,
Aye.
Vice Chair Harris.
Aye. Motion carries. Our first action item is approval to proceed to the EMC with proposed permanent rules 15A NCAC 02H.1401 through 1405, discharges to federally non-jurisdictional wetlands and federally non-jurisdictional classified surface waters, and permanent rule amendments for 15A NCAC 02H.1301, discharges to isolated wetlands and isolated waters, purpose and scope. This is being presented by Sue Homewood, Division of Water Resources 401 at Upper Permitting Branch.
Good afternoon. Thank you. You hear me okay? All right. Well, I won't read my title all over again. It's a long one, but I am here to request approval to proceed to the EMC in September to go out to public notice with these rules. All right. I need to figure out how to advance my slides. Up and down. Thank you. It's strange presenting in person again. Just real quick, an overview of my presentation. I'm going to do just a couple minutes putting everybody back on the same playing field, a refresher about this item. You did see a lot of this in the last few months, but just want to make sure that we're all starting off together. And then talk about some of the topics that came up during adoption of the temporary rules earlier this year. There were some questions that commission members have, and we appreciated your patience in letting us come back during permanent rule and try and expand upon some of those questions. And then eventually get to the reason we're here, and that is the draft permanent rules that we are proposing for public notice. So a little bit about the background again, recent changes back in 2020, so I'm not really sure whether we call that recent anymore, but the changes to the Clean Water Act federal jurisdiction for wetlands in certain landscape positions ended up creating a permitting gap in North Carolina for granting authorization to impact those wetlands. That permitting gap specifically applied to these federally non-jurisdictional wetlands as they were defined in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. They're not isolated wetlands, but rather wetlands that have a direct connection to downstream waters. So there was a permitting gap that DWR did not have a permitting mechanism to authorize impacts when someone needed to impact these. So as a result of that, the EMC adopted temporary permitting rules back in May to provide that permitting mechanism to the regulated community. We adopted temporary rules specifically to provide some expedited relief while the division moved forward with the longer, more in-depth process of permanent rulemaking. Just a side note that we talk a lot about wetlands, there were also changes to jurisdictional streams and other surface waters in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. But based on North Carolina geography and climate, that doesn't really come into play much. The impacts to stream permitting is pretty much de minimis. So that's why we talk about wetlands all the time, but the rule does cover streams and other surface waters also. So just visually, you saw this slide a few times already, but to bring everybody back, the image on the left is the federally jurisdictional wetlands that are subject to the Clean Water Act. Those are wetlands that are connected directly to jurisdictional streams and eventually to navigable waters. Nothing about the permitting program in North Carolina is changing with those that set of rules and wetlands. Those are covered under our 02H 0500 or the 401 certification rules. Far right is isolated wetlands. These are wetlands that are not connected to downstream waters. They are completely encompassed by uplands, and there's only overland sheet flow discharging from these wetlands. These are covered for permitting purposes under our 02H 1300 isolated wetlands permitting program, and nothing about that program is changing with these rules. That group in the middle in orange, they were previously federally jurisdictional wetlands, and now they are considered federally non-jurisdictional wetlands. They are not subject to the Clean Water Act. The difference with those wetlands is they are connected to downstream waters, but they're connected by a non-jurisdictional channel. So there is a direct connection. It's just not a federally regulated stream. So they ended up in a gap between jurisdictional wetlands and isolated wetlands. They didn't fit into either category. And we moved forward with temporary rules and now proposing permanent rules to cover permitting aspects of this set of wetlands. So the timeline proposed for these permanent rules, as I said, the EMC adopted temporary rules in May of 2021. Those became effective on May 28th. I'm here today to request to proceed out to public notice, to request to go to the EMC in September and request to proceed to go out to public notice at that time. Through the rest of this summer, we'll be working on finalizing our regulatory impact analysis to provide with the agenda item in September. If we go out to notice or if we succeed at the EMC in September, we would go out to notice in the fall. September through November would be the public notice and public hearing process. We would be drafting a hearing officer's report, finalizing the permanent rules in order to bring those permanent rules back to the full EMC in January of 2022. Now that whole timeline is predicated on meeting the February 22nd expiration date of the temporary rules. So the temporary rules that became effective in May have an expiration date of February 22nd. And we do not want to be in a situation of not having permanent rules in place prior to that expiration date. So now I'm just going to spend some time talking about some of the bigger questions that came up during the temporary rule process. First question that seemed to come up a few times is, how can there be different federal regulations and state regulations pertaining to wetlands? In order to answer that, I went to the preamble of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And in the preamble, it's where the federal agencies discuss their purpose of this rulemaking. They discuss all the aspects of it, questions and concerns they got during the public comment period and their answers. And throughout the entire preamble, which is a very long document, they state multiple times that the Navigable Waters Protection Rule was not conclusively determining which of the nation's waters warrant environmental protection and which do not. But the agencies, the federal agencies, were determining the boundary between which waters should be federally regulated and which waters should be managed by the states and the tribes. So another way to put that is they were trying to distinguish between that federal jurisdiction and that state jurisdiction. They stated multiple times in the preamble that the Clean Water Act specifically documents that it is set up such that the states would manage their water quality. So that's really how the Clean Water Act is designed, and that is how the Navigable Waters Protection Rule followed along with that, is that they were setting the limits of where the federal authority started and stopped, knowing and expecting states to have authority beyond that. In North Carolina, we already had that authority. Back in 1996, the EMC adopted wetland standards to protect the existing wetland functions in North Carolina because they provide for such important protection mechanisms to our state. They enhance food and agriculture community. They provide for flood and erosion control. They protect downstream water, whether it's our lakes for recreation, our estuaries for fish, or our groundwater for water supply. Wetlands provide protections to recreation area, habitat for many species. So all of that is recognized in our wetland standards. And what those standards say is that those wetlands are protected unless you have authorization from some sort of permit or certification to impact those, because those wetlands are essential for the water quality in North Carolina. So the Navigable Waters Protection Rule did not change any of that. We had that in place at that time, and that is maintained. We are not making any changes to the wetland standards. We are truly just talking about a permitting rule here. So another question that came up pretty frequently is how many of these federally non-jurisdictional wetlands are there in North Carolina? And can we see a map of where they are in North Carolina? And again, I'm going to refer back to the preamble of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The federal agencies get this question all the time. And multiple places in the preamble acknowledge that there are significant limitations to mapping these features, to knowing where they all are. There's no map, there's no data set that's available. The data sets that are available are they have such limitations that they're not appropriately used to determine where all the jurisdictional wetlands are and which ones change to non-jurisdictional as a result of the navigable waters rule. We even have a grant in the Division of Water Quality looking at some of those mapping and already seeing in North Carolina how inadequate those maps are. So the federal agencies recognize this. In fact, when they got this question, they said, we're sorry, we can't answer this question. We don't have a map. And they say that multiple times throughout the rule. We didn't want to just leave it there. We wanted to see if we could provide you with some information so that although there's no mapping available, we do have some data out there that we could gather and look to. A recent federal press release from the EPA and the Corps of Engineers indicates that the Navigable Waters Protection Rule has reduced jurisdiction to about 25% of the nation's waters. Now that includes streams, wetlands, and open waters, and it's nationwide, but they have analyzed some of the data that they have available and indicating that about 25% of the waters in the nation became non-jurisdictional after the Navigable Waters Rule. More specifically, in North Carolina, a private firm did an analysis of wetlands, sites that they were familiar with, that they used for training and teaching and research. And when they analyzed the wetland sites they had in-depth knowledge of, they came up with anywhere between 20 and 70% of the wetlands on a specific site became non-jurisdictional under the new Navigable Waters Rule. And a non-governmental organization did a study of GIS data, and they looked at river basins throughout the Southeast. The two that they looked at in North Carolina, their estimate was over 900,000 acres were going to become non-jurisdictional in just 2 river basins in the state. So while we can't provide a map and we can't provide exact numbers, we can provide some indication that we're not talking about a handful of wetlands out there and that they are throughout the state. We tried to delve even deeper, and what we did was look at the Army Corps of Engineers information available on their website. When the Army Corps of Engineers does an approved jurisdictional determination, they post that information on their website. So we were able to gather that information. I'm going to show that on the next couple slides. Couple important notes about that data. We only looked at where the Corps went and identified wetlands. We did not consider streams and surface waters because we were focusing on wetlands being the bigger issue in North Carolina. These are only sites where landowners or developers have requested the Corps to come out to and provide this very specific documentation. So it is a very small subset of sites, and it's very clustered around urban development areas because that's where the growth is. We looked at a subset of data. We looked at the 5 years prior to the Navigable Waters Rule and then the 10 years since then. I know those aren't equal timeframes, but they do give a valid picture of what was before and what we're dealing with now. So for the 5 years prior to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, the categories that the Corps of Engineers would identify were jurisdictional wetlands and isolated wetlands. And you can see on the map that isolated wetlands are very few and far between. There were 71 records of a total 2,400 sites. So, the previous regulations, isolated wetlands were a small handful of wetlands across the state. Compare that to the 10 months that since the Navigable Waters Protection Rule existed. And again, this is a small set of data, but it does give us some tendencies. The Corps of Engineers identified 44 federally non-jurisdictional wetlands and 78 jurisdictional wetlands. So that's a much different percentage. Again, as I said, you can see those are clustered in more the urban areas because that's where the growth is. That's where people request the Corps to come out. It's not indicative of where these are in general, it's where the growth is. So when you put that data side by side in these charts, you can see that the 10 years prior to Navigable Waters Rule, isolated wetlands were about 3% of all the wetlands in the state. After that, the wetlands that the Corps of Engineers was identified as non-jurisdictional was about 36%. And that's in that range where the federal press release said 25%, and some of those other studies said 20 to 70%. So we feel pretty comfortable that at least those percentages are in the right ballpark. But that is about a third of the wetlands they're finding they were classifying as non-jurisdictional. So while we can't show you a map and we can't tell you the total number, we can confidently say it is a significant number of wetlands in North Carolina that these rules will apply to. So then going to the next step of where to take that question is how many projects will these rules affect? Well, to answer that, we would need the maps, which we don't have because there's just not that good information. We also don't have an ability to predict where future growth will be. So we don't really have 100% certainty of who will need these rules. You would think that now that we have temporary rules, that we would have applications in-house that we can look at and say, how many applications are coming in? Right now, we only have 2 applications that have been submitted so far since the temporary rules went into effect. And the reason for that is that when we wrote those temporary rules, we established a deemed permitted threshold where people below a certain number don't have to come to the state and ask for approval. We established those pretty high. So those projects that we kept telling you are desperate for those temporary rules, they all fell, or the majority of them fell under the deemed permitted status. So they just went on and started building their projects when those rules became effective. So we don't have those applications in-house. What we were able to look at was applications that we had over the last few years for 401 certifications for jurisdictional wetlands. We know that all these non-jurisdictional wetlands are a subset of what used to be jurisdictional. It's a subset of maybe 36% of them. So if we look at the permits we have, or the certifications we have issued over the last couple of years, we've issued approximately on average 275 authorizations for people to impact wetlands a year. And if we multiply that times 36%, we get about 100 applications. That's a very, very rough estimate. It does not include projects that didn't have to get approval from the division. It's only the projects that triggered some necessary approval from us, but it does give us an idea of what scale. Keep in mind that that 100 is a subset of the 275. It is not in addition to the 275. This workload is exactly the same as what it was prior to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. It's just a different set of rules that these people will be applying under. And then lastly, we heard the question about the fiscal impact of these rules. And since temporary rules do not have to have a fiscal impact, we had not delved into that. We could not provide information during the temporary rule process, but we have begun that process in expectation to have a full regulatory impact analysis for the September EMC meeting should we go forward at that time. But we have provided a screening analysis to provide context and background to identify what we're looking at and where we're going. So that screening analysis was attached to the agenda item. It provides information on the potential costs and benefits of the proposed rules. Probably most importantly, it provides an explanation of the regulatory baseline where we're going to have to start for the fiscal analysis. And what that regulatory baseline is going to have to be, as established by OSBM, is the situation that occurred when the Navigable Waters Protection Rule went into effect. So that means that the day the Navigable Waters Protection Rule went into effect, we had a set of wetlands that nobody could impact because we didn't have permitting rules. The regulatory impact analysis cannot consider the temporary rule in part of its cost-benefit analysis. We can acknowledge the temporary rule and we can provide some comparisons, but when it comes down to the positives and negatives, we won't factor in what occurred when during the period the temporary rule is in effect. So that's something that's important to take into account as we move forward developing that fiscal analysis. We've provided at the point in time now all the evaluations and considerations that we're looking further into to provide that full regulatory impact analysis. So now I'm just going to jump into the rules finally and how we went about drafting these permanent rules. So we were in a unique situation because we had temporary rules that had gone out to public notice. Normally when the agency is bringing you a request for permanent rules, we might not have gone out to notice yet. So those temporary rules, as a reminder, went out to notice back in March. We received 550 comments at that point in time, and that hearing officer's report was presented to the EMC in May. Of those 550 comments, the vast majority were in favor of the rules, but they provided a statement that said, well, we want and understand the need for these rules, and we would like you to go forward with these rules to provide regulatory relief. We have concerns about moving forward with temporary rules. And so they provided us direction and comments to consider as we were going through the permanent rules. And the commenters specifically said that in most of the comments. The biggest comment was that the deemed permitted thresholds were too high. They recognized the need for the temporary rules and did not want to slow that process down, but they wanted to make sure that we heard them that those thresholds were too high. So we also did a permanent rule stakeholder process. We invited stakeholders to 2 virtual meetings in April and May. It was a variety across a scope of agencies representing everyone who would be affected by these rules. It was the same group at both meetings. It just took us 2 meetings to get through all the topics. And we asked the stakeholders to provide comments on some specific topics that we knew that had come up during the temporary rule process. We asked them to provide specific comments on language in the temporary rules so we could go forward if we were going to use those as a starting place for permanent rules. And we also asked them if there was anything we were missing. We asked them to point out anything that we hadn't already brought up and discussed. So we feel like we covered everything. At the end, we didn't end up needing any more meetings to go through all the topics. So then the division took all that information, which, as I said, was sort of unique and more than we normally have as we're starting this process. We had those comments we received during the temporary rule. We had the comments from the stakeholder meetings. We had some comments from staff at the Rules Review Commission where they had some questions about language we used and how we worded things that they let go through the temporary rule process, but asked us to dig into them deeper during permanent. And we had the beginning parts of the fiscal analysis. We understood what OSBM was going to set as our baseline. So we started looking at all that. And we have drafted permanent rules that include some modifications to some language. The majority of that is for clarity. Long sentences may be broken up into multiple sections or itemized lists. A few places where people said, can you explain this better? So we added more language, but we didn't really change the intent. And then we went back and looked at the thresholds that we had, those deemed permitted thresholds that were being talked about. And we looked at what thresholds are used in our jurisdictional wetland program and what's used in our isolated wetland program and all the comments we received. And we proposed permanent rules that have thresholds that match the jurisdictional wetland deemed permitted thresholds. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. So just to make sure the terminology, everybody's following along, the term deemed permitted threshold is an amount where under that, the entity wouldn't have to come to the division for approval. There may be some conditions in the rule that say you still have to protect downstream water quality or you have to employ erosion control measures, but you don't have to come and seek approval before doing your project if you're under that deemed permitted threshold. That is a well-established permitting approach that we use in the other wetland programs, as well as many of the other agency programs, wastewater, sediment erosion control, stormwater. If a project is going to propose to impact above those thresholds, that just means they go through a review process. It does not mean it stops the project. They just come in and explain why those impacts are unavoidable. Is it a unique topography to the site? Is it a monster Amazon distribution center that they can't make any smaller? So they explain that process in the documentation. They explain what they're going to do to make sure downstream water is protected and we don't have downstream water quality violations. And then they provide for mitigation to compensate for that loss of wetlands. So if they're going to impact a wetland and it's going to go away and it won't provide those protection functions to downstream waters, they compensate for that by mitigation, creating and restoring wetlands elsewhere. So when we wrote the temporary rules, we used the deemed permitted thresholds that were in the isolated wetlands permitting rules. And we had some very specific reasons at that point in time to look at our isolated wetlands and mirror those. One of those is simplicity. We wanted the regulated community to be given a set of rules that they were familiar with, that they could just hit the ground running because their projects were on hold at this point in time. We needed to provide them with something they weren't going to have a lot of concerns or questions, didn't take us, the staff, developing new applications and procedures. So we mirrored a set of rules that existed already. And we wanted to provide them with immediate regulatory relief. So we recognized at that point in time, these projects have been on hold while we're going through this process. They were caught off guard. They couldn't plan for that ahead of time. We didn't realize this was coming. So we wanted, when these rules were passed, we wanted the majority of projects to be able to go ahead and not then still have another application and review process to go through. So that was intentional. Also, we were still evaluating some of the information that I provided in the previous slides, we didn't have a grasp of how many wetlands there were in the state. We didn't have a grasp of what the Corps of Engineers was even going to call non-jurisdictional. So we took a conservative approach and said, these isolated wetlands have very generous thresholds. We'll adopt those for now until we're certain moving forward what the impacts of these permitting rules might be. We also needed to understand we wanted to evaluate staff resources. We didn't want to put into place a program we couldn't implement. So all that put together, we chose to mirror the isolated wetland permits because they had generous thresholds in them. But that said, we heard from an overwhelming number of people through this process that we chose thresholds that were too high. They were too high to protect downstream water quality in North Carolina. That cumulatively, now that we're realizing how many of these wetlands fall into this category, that cumulatively the impacts to those can really affect downstream water quality and watershed protection, and that these wetlands are significantly important. So during the stakeholder meeting, as I said, we heard from commenters during the temporary rules, during the stakeholder meetings. Commenters provided to us the analysis that these wetlands are connected to downstream waters. They are more like jurisdictional wetlands. They have that direct connection. They have that potential to carry pollutants or not to downstream waters, so that they should be looked at more like jurisdictional wetlands. They were, in fact, jurisdictional wetlands prior to 2020. We just moved them into another category. We should keep the thresholds similar to jurisdictional wetlands because that is what they function more similarly to. And there are thresholds in that program which provide for review, avoidance and minimization, and mitigation for those unavoidable losses that occur. So we went and looked at those thresholds that are in the jurisdictional wetlands. For the most part, jurisdictional wetlands have a deemed permitted threshold of 1/10 of an acre. There are some exceptions, but that's the most common across the board. And that same threshold is for the deemed permitted situation and then for compensatory mitigation. So it's nice in that you can pick one threshold and it pretty much covers the project. If you go above that number, you need review approval and provide compensatory mitigation. This is something that the regulated community is extremely familiar with this process. As I said, these wetlands would have been in this process a year ago. But we did want to look and say, okay, how many projects do we think that's going to affect? Well, now that we've looked at 1/10 of an acre as our threshold, what does that mean to the regulated community? Again, we don't have applications for these wetlands, but we can go back and look at what we had for 401 certifications. And when we looked at all the applications we had over the last couple of years, 60% of them impacted less than 1/10 of an acre. So the bulk of applications we even saw, they were impacting less than 1/10 of an acre. These were cases where they didn't maybe meet the deemed permitted because they were in possibly a buffer basin, or they also had stream impacts that they went over the deemed permitted threshold. So these are projects that we saw. There were many more projects out there that impacted less of 1/10 of an acre that we never saw. But even when you look at the ones we saw, we're talking about 60% of maybe 100 projects out there. It's a pretty small number. The regulated community is very, very good at avoiding and minimizing these regulations. Wetland regulations have been around for decades. They know the process. The very first thing they do is figure out where their wetlands are on their site, and they avoid and minimize as much as they can. This process is something that's not going to be new. It's something that they're familiar with. So just real quick, we do acknowledge that the EPA and the Corps have announced their intention to revise the definition of the waters of the U.S., to go back and revisit the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, potentially repeal it, potentially replace it with something else. Unfortunately, that federal process will likely take a significant amount of time, too much time for us to rely on that to sit back and see where things go. We have that February 22nd, 2022 expiration date. If a set of permanent rules are not adopted by that time, the regulated community would end up back in the same situation we were prior to May, where their projects would just be put on hold. And we certainly don't want that to happen. So while we know that the federal government is starting the process, we cannot rely on that process to drive our actions. We have not changed the permitting rules for the 401 certification program or the isolated wetlands program. So regardless of what happens, those rules are still there, and projects can use those. If this set of rules, the 1,400 rules, become unnecessary based on something the federal agencies do, then they'll just sit there as obsolete until we have an opportunity to repeal them. We also think that they are written robustly enough that should what falls into this set be a different number, larger or smaller than 36% of wetlands, these rules could cover them regardless of what the Corps says in the future is non-jurisdictional and what isn't. So we think that regardless of how the federal government ends up, these rules will be fine. We'll have a suite of rules that we can use, and we shouldn't have to come back and revise at that point in time. And so with that, the division would like to request that the Water Quality Committee approve us to proceed to the EMC in September with a request to go out to public notice and hearing with these rules. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Sunwood. Any questions from members of the committee? Very thorough presentation.
Chair Deering, this is Donna Davis. I don't have any questions, but I do want to commend the staff on answering several of the questions that were brought up and that they were not able to answer at a previous meeting. So I appreciate that effort.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. I think we all agree with you on that. Thanks. I was surprised that there were only 2 applicants with the 1 acre threshold. Concerned how many parties took action at the less than 1 acre. We don't have a good sense of that, do we?
We do not know.
Commissioner Gass, did I see you about to ask a question or comment?
Actually, well, one small question, regulatory impact analysis.
Would you move your microphone?
Sorry, thank you, Sheriff. One small question, the regulatory impact analysis development is to be completed in August. And is that doable?
We're doing our best.
This is some very quick rulemaking that you have 6 months time and for a very good purpose. The temporary rules do expire 7 months. So this, I commend the department for getting all this and getting it done. It does strike me that that's all.
Yeah. Luckily, Julie Ventiloro is good at this and working really hard to get us that document. And she's been in communications with OSBM. So we are identifying the heavy lift, but we're still hopeful to meet that goal.
Okay.
I think the screen analysis is off to a good start. I'm impressed with how far we advanced on screening analysis so that we can have information.
Madam Chair, if I may, one other background question. The comments about no actual mapping exists, is it really anticipated that mapping will exist someday, or is it likely that on-site wetland delineation will always be the means by which this is determined?
That is a very good question. There are people working hard. Technology and data resources advance all the time. So there are entities going back and looking at the National Wetland Inventory and how accurate and inaccurate it is. And as I mentioned, we in the division received a grant from EPA to even do a small study of that. And I hope to have that available in September. In the preamble of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, the federal agencies said they have always said this can't be done, but for the first time they said we think it's worth trying. So whether that's a 2-year process or a 20-year process, or they eventually give up after trying, I'm not really sure. I think there will be more predictability in the future. The National Wetland Inventory is not very helpful. It underpredicts what's out there, but I think that the tools exist that will have better predictability, maybe less need to do on-site verifications. But I don't know if it'll ever go away completely.
former colleagues that were part of an EPA project in the southeast to develop GIS-based predictive isolated wetlands. And that went on for 2 to 4 years, and we have had other activities since then. There is potential. Vice Chair Harris, I think. Anyway, I'll be. Commissioner Lazort has joined us. Welcome. Commissioner Carter, did you have any questions or comments? Is Commissioner Carter unmuted? If there are none, obtain a motion. The next step would be to carry this to the full EMC in September. If anyone cares to make that motion, you might want to use the language that's in our slide.
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Davis. I move that the Water Quality Committee approve to proceed to the EMC to initiate public notice in the hearing process for the proposed permanent rules 15A NC AC 02H.1401 through 1405 and proposed permanent amendments to Rule 15A NCAC 02H.1301.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Martin, seconds. Any further discussion? None, I will do a roll call of votes. Commissioner Carter, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner McAdams?
Aye.
Commissioner Manis?
Aye.
Vice Chair Harris?
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next action item is requesting approval to proceed to the EMC with the 2021 Pasquotank Basin Water Resources Plan. Presenting will be Forrest Shepherd, Division of Water Resources Basin Planning. I think this is the first time that Mr. Shepherd's been in a live meeting with the EMC. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be able to present to you also. Thank you. So, good afternoon. I want to thank the committee and the chair for the opportunity to present to you today. Today we'll be requesting approval to proceed to the Environmental Management Commission with the 2021 Pasquotank River Basin Water Resources Plan. In today's presentation, I will provide a quick overview of basin planning, review the basin plan timeline, and highlight portions of the 2021 Pasquotank River Basin Water Resources Plan. The timeline for this plan is different than the Chowan River Basin Water Resources Plan in 2 ways. First, we are bringing it to the Water Quality Committee after it's been out for public comment. Second, we are bringing this to the Water Quality Committee as an action item instead of as an information item before taking it to the full EMC. Basin planning is a watershed-based approach to managing water resources and considers the cumulative impact of all activities across a river basin from both point and non-point sources of pollution. The 2021 Pasquotank River Basin Water Resources Plan, or Basin Plan, is a reflection of this planning process and serves as a summary document for the river basin. A basin plan is required every 10 years, and a basin plan is not a rule. Basin planners began engaging stakeholders early on in the Pasquotank plan development to understand local concerns and water resources issues stakeholders have seen in their river basin. Some of these concerns included future development and population growth, water quality and quantity protection and monitoring, especially in lowlands, conservation of riparian buffers, concerns over deforestation and biomass harvesting, a need for best management practices, incentives for in-stream wetlands on private land, swamp forest conservation, living shorelines, watershed scale planning, resiliency, oysters, drainage, and water quality, retrofitting drainage with wetlands and shoreline stabilization. There was also concerns over flooding and environmental contamination, sea level rise and extreme rainfall, climate change, saltwater intrusion in agricultural lands close to the sound, especially on the southern shore, groundwater rise, a need to identify areas with better drainage, and some areas have actually formed drainage committees, as well as public engagement. We also had a basin liaison, Commissioner Arata, who worked closely with us as well. There was also an internal review process of the basin plan by multiple NCDQ divisions, sections, and branches, as well as a public comment period during which we received comments from several of the soil and water conservation districts in the basin, the North Carolina Farm Bureau, and local citizens. Those comments were included as part of the supporting documents for today's request. The 2021 Pasquotank River Basin Plan is the fourth document to be developed by the Pasquotank River Basin by the Department of Environmental Quality. The plan includes 9 chapters covering water quality and quantity in the basin. The Pasquotank River Basin is located in the northeastern corner of the Coastal Plain Province, spanning southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. There are 11 counties and 13 municipalities located wholly or partially in the Pasquotank River Basin. And since 2000, Dare County, especially in the Outer Banks, has seen population growth in all of their municipalities. There's also frequent tourists to that area, and they experience significant increases in population due to seasonal floods. The North Carolina portion of the Pasquotank River Basin spans 3,367 square miles, with approximately 1/3 of the land area as open water in dark blue. Another third is wetlands in light blue, and roughly 1/5 of the area is agriculture, followed by forest, developed shrub, barren, grassland, and herbaceous land cover. And nutrients, algal blooms, altered hydrology, and flooding continue to be water-related issues throughout the river basin, the rivers of this basin. As part of the basin planning process, basin planners alongside the Division of Water Resources Washington Regional Office reviewed how permitted facilities may be impacting water resources. The total number of permitted wastewater, stormwater, non-discharge, and animal feeding operations are included in the basin plan. And if available, the basin plan also identifies areas in which on-site wastewater treatment systems or septic systems may be impacting water resources. For water quantity, the basin plan includes the total number of facilities registered or permitted to withdraw water within the basin. The review was coupled with monitoring data collected between 2006 and 2019 from benthic macroinvertebrate communities, algal bloom reports, surface waters, lakes, groundwater monitoring data, and sanitary surveys for waters of the Pasquotank River Basin. As of 2018, certain waters in the basin are on the impaired waters list. A list of these impaired waters is currently on the slide. All of these impaired rivers and sounds are discussed in the Pasquotank River Basin Plan, but for this talk, we're going to highlight just a few of them, as well as some of the work that's ongoing in the northern and southern sides of the Pasquotank River Basin, in the Outer Banks, as well as the Albemarle Sound. On the northern side of the Pasquotank River Basin, the Little River and the Pasquotank River are on the impaired waters list. These impairments are discussed in the plan, so we'll highlight just the Little River today. Similar to other northern shore watersheds, such as the Pasquotank to the right of the Little River watershed and the Perquimans to the left of the Little River watershed, have roughly half of their land area consisting of agriculture in yellow, followed by wetlands, open water in dark blue, forest in dark green, developed land in red, and grassland and shrubs in light green and orange respectively. The Little River is on the impaired waters list for chlorophyll A, indicating that excess nutrients are likely contributing to the algal blooms in the river. Because of this, during the 2016 and 2018 time period, the Albemarle Resource Conservation and Development Council, also known as ARC&D, Pasquotank County, Perquimans County, and Pasquotank Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as the Perquimans Soil and Water Conservation District, partnered together to use grants to construct a 4,800-foot in-stream wetland on a farm canal in the upper portion of the Little River. Additionally, 2,000 feet of in-stream wetland was installed on a farm canal just above the impaired section of the Little River. And another 2,000-foot in-stream wetland was installed on a privately owned canal that drains approximately 3,200 acres of agricultural land and solar farms in Pasquotank County side of the Little River watershed. These in-stream wetland projects had two objectives: to monitor their effectiveness of removing nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as capturing sediment, and educate the general public about the importance of these types of wetlands for protecting and improving water quality in the Little River watershed. The three projects also include improvements to drainage and water management on adjacent cropland, which helped show the landowners that they would get better crop production, even though they had to give up some of their land for wetlands and buffers. During these projects, the in-stream wetlands became integral components of the farmers' overall efforts to improve drainage and water management on their cropland. Water quality monitoring of two in-stream wetlands during the plan establishment phase showed only minor nutrient concentration changes in each pollutant parameter, while the total suspended solids reductions appeared to be the highest among the pollutants evaluated. Although initial results indicate minor nutrient concentration changes, ARC&D notes that longer periods of monitoring are needed, approximately 4 to 5 years, to effectively measure the water quality performance of these in-stream wetlands under natural conditions. Several local citizens, as well as watershed action groups, are actively documenting algal blooms throughout the Little River watershed, as well as other parts of the basin. Moving on to the southern shore of the Pasquotank River Basin, Kendricks Creek, Main Canal, and Alligator River are on the 2018 impaired waters list. Again, these impairments are discussed in the plan, so we will highlight the water management related concerns in this region. Cycles of flooding and drought on the regional properties have prompted citizens from local communities, landowners, and stakeholders. In response to those concerns, the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership with Washington and Terrell counties received grant funding in 2019 for the Scuppernong Coastal System Regional Water Management Study. The study will become part of an important decision support tool to guide future potential water management implementation actions in collaboration with other regional stakeholders, including local governments, other state and federal agencies, and private landowners. Potential applications include informing management actions on and off of conservation lands, explaining impacts of climate variability and recurrent flooding, improving regional drainage efficiency and community resilience strategies, improving agricultural best management practices, and updating existing plans. It can also provide information and resources to implement actions identified by the Natural and Working Lands Pocosin Wetland Subteam, addressing directives of Executive Order 80 and the Climate Risk and Resiliency Plan. In addition, the study may benefit regional economic development strategies, such as supporting sustainable agriculture and diversifying the rural economy by strengthening water-based economies and capitalizing upon the natural resources of the region through ecotourism and recreation. In the Outer Banks, we do not have ambient or benthic monitoring conducted by the Division of Water Resources, but the Division of Marine Fisheries monitors the shellfish growing areas. Shellfish include clams, oysters, and mussels. Shellfish growing areas are classified as approved, conditionally approved, restricted, and prohibited. Approved areas are in blue and are consistently open, while prohibited areas in red are permanently closed. Conditionally approved areas can be open to harvest under certain conditions, such as dry weather when stormwater runoff is not having an impact on surrounding water quality, and restricted waters can be used for harvest at certain times, as long as the shellfish are subjected to further cleansing before they are made available for consumption. The Division of Marine Fisheries Shellfish Sanitation Section monitoring has helped identify these impaired waters on the 2018 list. A sanitary survey for each shellfish growing area is done every 3 years. The survey includes a shoreline survey of all existing or potential pollution sources, a hydrographic and meteorological survey, as well as a bacteriological survey of the shellfish growing waters. Shoreline surveys assess areas of concern and the impacts of potential pollution sources like wildlife and domestic animals, marinas and multi-slip docks, golf courses, stormwater, subdivisions, and wastewater treatment. Sanitary surveys in the shellfish growing areas of the Albemarle Sound had been limited due to reductions in staff. Therefore, monitoring of the I-1 through I-16, which is this large red area through here, have been stopped. This information is broken down into different shellfish growing areas and presented in the Pasquotank River Basin Plan. This report also pays special attention to the nitrogen species, total phosphorus, chlorophyll A, and algal bloom data over time. Throughout the Albemarle Sound and Pasquotank River Basin, in an effort to communicate changes in the in-stream nutrient concentrations. As discussed previously, excess nutrients and algal blooms are water-related concerns in this region of the state. To help orient people to the graphs and associated map, first, the blue colors are the 3 stations located on the western side of the Albemarle Sound. The green are the stations located in the middle of the Albemarle Sound, and the purple colors are the stations located on the eastern side of the Albemarle Sound. And if you notice, there's 3 stations for each color group located on the northern side, the middle, and the southern side. Also, if you look closely at the bars, you'll see there are orange borders around bars that indicate at least 3 months of data might be missing, or, well, not collected. Now, if we look closely at the annual average distribution of total phosphorus concentrations in the Albemarle Sound, you see that they generally appear to decline as they observed from west to east. The nitrogen concentrations appear to follow the same distribution, with higher concentrations on the west and lower concentrations on the east. There also appears to be higher total phosphorus concentrations, possibly coming from the northern side tributaries. If you compare the bars that have northern, middle, and southern, you'll see that we're getting a little bit higher phosphorus concentrations coming out of the northern shore tributaries, and that's a general case. This is the same for nitrate, where we're seeing high nitrate, nitrogen concentrations possibly coming from the southern shores. As we reviewed the nutrient concentrations from those tributaries, we noted the elevated concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen. Notably, the Little River on the northern side of the basin had the highest total phosphorus concentrations, and the Scuppernong and Kendricks Creek on the southern shore had the highest nitrogen concentrations. Currently, discharge information is not available, so nutrient loading trends were not evaluated. However, Nathan Hall and Hans Pearl from the University of North Carolina Institute of Marine Sciences has completed a quantitative analysis of this region for the Albemarle Commission. Their work concluded that the tributaries of the Albemarle Sound, like the Scuppernong River and Kendricks Creek, given the high concentrations and more rapid increases in total nitrogen loads from the coastal plain streams that were assessed, and the fact that such streams constitute about a quarter of the total watershed of the Albemarle Sound, it is possible that the smaller and largely unassessed coastal plain streams contribute up to 45% of the nitrogen and phosphorus loads to the Albemarle Sound. Their report to the Albemarle Commission is referenced in the plan. The Division of Water Resources does not currently have an in-stream phosphorus or nitrogen standard. Organic nitrogen, which mostly comes from plant material or organic matter, can exist in considerable proportions and contribute substantially to concentrations of total nitrogen in streams. While reviewing the in-stream organic nitrogen in Albemarle Sound, they appear to be increasing over time and as observed from west to east. If we zoom in by removing the outlier, we can see that the most recent 10 years on record, 2010 to 2019, displayed this pattern more frequently and with larger range in organic nitrogen concentrations between the west and the east. Increases in organic nitrogen concentrations often coincide with increases in biological productivity in these systems. Another signal of biological productivity can be found in the concerning chlorophyll A and pH concentrations in the eastern Albemarle Sound. Along the top is chlorophyll A, and the bottom is pH for the ambient stations along the center channel of the Albemarle Sound. The red lines on the scatter plots indicate 40 micrograms per liter standard for chlorophyll A and the 9 and 8.5 pH standards for the Albemarle Sound. Similar to the organic nitrogen signature in the Albemarle Sound, chlorophyll A and pH concentrations generally increase from west to east in the Albemarle Sound, which is a sign of increased biological activity. This plan also reports that the northern and southern watershed tributaries are also responding to excess nutrient concentrations as seen by the elevated levels of chlorophyll A within those systems. Algal blooms, which result in elevated chlorophyll A concentrations, also occur throughout the Albemarle Sound. If you look at the locations for the 2018 and 2019 algal blooms, we see that these occur along the Albemarle Sound and the northern shore tributaries. Although microcystin concentrations are low, many of these algal blooms contain cyanobacterial or blue-green algae as their dominant taxa. And these algae can produce cyanotoxins. Moving on to water use. Because a hydrologic or water supply model has not been developed for the basin, information about water use and availability is based off the best available data from various water quantity programs. These include the Water Withdrawal and Transfer Registration, local water supply plans, Central Coastal Plain Capacity Use Area, and the 2018 Agricultural Water Use Survey published by the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Groundwater is the source for domestic water use in the basin, and based on information presented in the local water supply plans, collectively, public water supply systems in the Pasquotank River Basin are expected to have adequate water supplies to meet current and future demands. Closing out on a few selected recommendations, there is a critical need for technology that can distinguish a specific nitrogen signature in order to identify a specific source, such as agricultural animal type, domestic waste, or a background forest and sediment signature. We should continue to work with the Nutrient Criteria Development Plan Scientific Advisory Council to develop appropriate protective criteria, which could be response or causal variables for the Chowan River and Albemarle Sound. And lastly, this was a comment from Mark Powell, who works with ARC&D. This is one of his recommendations, which is broad partnerships should include local nonprofits, county governments, soil and water conservation districts, state agencies from North Carolina and Virginia, universities, and citizens that are all working together to monitor water quality and quantity in northeastern North Carolina. With that, the Division of Water Resources requests approval to proceed to the EMC with the 2021 Pasquotank River Basin Water Resources Plan. And I thank you, and we will do our best to answer questions. We have a few people on the line, and we have a few people in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. I understand that Commissioner Rod is likely following online, recognizing her as EMC liaison to this basin. Thank you, Commissioner Rod. Are there any questions?
I'm just curious for the areas that were noted as shellfish areas. Is there any oyster farms or small fish farmers that are doing oyster farming in the area?
I mostly, from what I've learned, it's mostly near the Pamlico side. So where that blue side starts to form is where there are at least a chance of oysters. It seems like the salinity levels aren't quite correct in the Albemarle Sound. I'm not an oyster expert, but my best educated guess is that there's not a large oyster fisheries up here, but I very well could be wrong.
Carteret area, larger areas are reserved for oyster fisheries.
I do want to note that these are just administrative, a lot of this is administrative closures. Do you mind if I add a comment onto this? Also, I have heard that crabbing is quite good out here. So.
Well, out here, well,
No.
I understand. I understand correctly, that's been bundled with agriculture. Or golf courses and
Understood. So I can't speak to previous uses of golf courses in these documents or how they were maybe more experienced staff could. But for the specific comment regarding golf courses, we did expand upon at least identifying the locations of those golf courses. There is some information that comes out of water withdrawal and transfer registrations where they speak about how much golf courses, well, they mention golf courses. So we brought that information forward, but their impacts and the impacts from golf courses, we did not expound upon that. Just it seems quite difficult to pull that information.
That's a question. We appreciate the change in timing that's coming before. So with that, I'll accept a motion. Anyone's inclined to carry this to full EMC. September vote, is that right?
Yes.
I make a motion if we have language, or just. I move to approve to proceed to the EMC with the 2021 Pasco River Basin Water Resources Plan.
Thank you, Commissioner Mize. Do I have a second?
I second. This is Commissioner Davis.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. Further discussion about this plan? I think we're scheduled to see quite a coming up. Got 3 meetings in a row of basin planning. Thank y'all for that. So taking a roll call vote. Motion before us. Commissioner Carter. Commissioner Carter. Commissioner Davis.
Aye.
Commissioner McAdams.
Okay, that would be a help.
Yes.
That'd be fine.
Commissioner McAdams.
I'm abstaining.
Okay. Commissioner McAdams abstaining. Commissioner
I
Mize.
just need to get this Merbetric. Yeah, I don't really need to talk to her. If she can just organize the refill of the.
Commissioner Carter, we can hear your voice.
Do that MYR.
Muted. Okay, Commissioner Mize.
Yes.
Vice Chair Harris.
Aye.
Commissioner Carter. Would you care to vote today on this motion for the Pasco County? Sounded as if you might be in the middle of a phone call.
Really signed in there or not, and I was going to ask you about that too.
Okay. We'll continue to move. So we have 1, 2, 3 ayes, 1 abstention. And will that be sufficient? Don't need chairs, but chairs very supportive. There's a majority. So we do have.
Commissioner Deerheck,
Yeah,
this is Commissioner Arata. I'm sorry to chime in here.
yeah.
I just wanted to say thanks to the staff. It was great to work with them on this. We met a few times, and in particular, the way that this plan is laid out to complement the Chowan River Basin plan and provide the amount of information that could possibly be provided is, I think, a very helpful tool, and it resulted in a great plan. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lowe. Chair will vote yes, so that we ensure that we get 4 out of 6 members attending.
This is Commissioner Carter. I had to step away, but I would vote yes too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good. Thanks very much. Our next action item is with water supply watershed protection. We have an overview and an update, including the 2020 annual water supply watershed protection Universal Stormwater Management Program, MS4 Phase 2 report approval. Presenting will be Lucas, Education of Energy, Mineral, and Renewable Source.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Annette Lucas. I'm the supervisor of the Dimmler Stormwater Program, and Paul Clark was supposed to give this presentation. I'm really sorry that he's not available to do this, but I'm going to do my best in his stead. I actually have agenda items 3 and 4 are both assigned to me, and those actually involve there's 2 agenda items, but actually 3 things are in those 2 agenda items. The first thing is that we are just simply highlighting an annual report that Paul Clark prepared on behalf of our division, and this is an update on the various types of local government programs that we oversee in the stormwater program. So those are the Universal Stormwater Management Program, the Water Supply Watershed Program, and the MS4 program. These are all programs, a few of them even overlap with each other. We have the USMP is fairly stable. We've had some really good improvements and steps forward even during COVID with our Water Supply Watershed Program, our MS4 program. You can read about it here. It's just a short report. I'm not going to talk about that. We usually don't do a presentation on that, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have when the water supply presentation is done. And the second thing is we have just a general update about the Water Supply Watershed Program. So that's an information item, but the last thing is an action item. So after many years, we have updated the model ordinance for the Water Supply Watershed communities, and we're going to be asking for your approval of that updated ordinance when this is over. So let me just commence with Paul's presentation. So the purpose of the Water Supply Watershed Program is exactly what it says. It's to protect our drinking water supplies. And we have rules that are stormwater rules. They have a couple different approaches they take to stormwater. The first one is to minimize the volume of stormwater runoff. And more importantly, or more of a focus of the rules, I should say, is minimizing the pollutant load of stormwater runoff. That's through a couple different measures. One is we have vegetated setbacks that keep the development away from the streams and other waters as much as possible. We also limit built upon area, and if a development goes over high density thresholds for built upon area, it's required to have stormwater control measures. The Water Supply Watershed Program is the only stormwater program that we have that has an absolute maximum that you can't go over that maximum, and the threshold varies depending on the classification of the water supply watershed. So here's a history. This is a program that we've had for a long time. It's one of our first stormwater programs. The first one was the Coastal Stormwater Program, and the second one is the Water Supply Watershed Program. So it started with the legislature in 1989. And we first adopted rules as an agency in 1992. And those rules required the local governments to develop their own program. And there's a lot of local governments. Unlike some of our other programs, like the MS4 program, that focuses on the local governments in more urbanized areas. In the Water Supply Watershed Program, we have a lot of communities in fairly rural areas, maybe don't have a big staff. So this program requires a lot of mentoring, and Paul does a great job with that. He spends a lot of time assisting these communities. We revised the rules for the first time in 1995, and then in 2012 we had an update to the general statute that talked about density averaging. I'll mention that a little bit more in a few minutes. And then most recently in 2019 we revised the rules and that was part of the rules review and readoption process. We didn't greatly change the requirements in the water supply watershed program, but we did some reorganization of the rules to make them more consistent with some of the other stormwater rules. We updated some of the definitions, like how low density is defined, for example, so it would be consistent across our stormwater programs. Okay, water supply watershed, as you probably already know, is one of our primary water quality classifications. So with freshwater, waters are Class B, Class C, and then water supply watershed is also a primary classification. And then we have various types of supplemental water quality classifications. So in water supply watersheds, we have both the critical area and then the balance of the water supply watershed. And there's more stringent requirements, as you may imagine, in the critical area, where we're closer to either the reservoir or the point in the stream where the intake is for the water supply, where the water supply is. So with the critical area, if we have a reservoir, it's within a half mile of the shore of the lake. And then the balance of the watershed is 5 additional miles is the protected area. If we have a run of river where the intake is actually in a stream or river, the critical area is within a half mile of the point of the intake. And then the balance of the watershed is 10 miles. And we have a map, and you can see, you know, here in Wilkes County is one of our more rural counties. You can see that there's quite a few different types of water supply watersheds. So, you know, the program would be administered by Wilkes County, but the thresholds for low density and high density would vary based on the classification of where the development is located. And like I said, there's a lot of communities. We have 82 counties, 207 municipalities, and 1 airport authority. So Paul's phone rings off the hook, and he does a really good job mentoring these. Yeah, and there's a picture of himself, 1 coordinator trying to help them all. Plus, he does a lot of other things for our program as well to support us. So really appreciate what he does. Okay, so the local governments who have water supply watershed programs, they have quite a few responsibilities as part of that water supply watershed program. First of all, they have to have an ordinance. So by now, they've all developed an ordinance. We provide a model ordinance, and the action item is going to be for you all to approve an update to the ordinance because of some of the things that have happened with the rules and the change in the general statute from 2012 that still isn't incorporated in the ordinance yet. They also have to develop their own maps of where the water supply watershed boundaries are. They have to have a process for variances when a developer needs a variance to some of the water supply watershed requirements. Some of them have interlocal agreements. For example, a county may administer the water supply watershed program for a small community within the county. We have that quite a bit throughout the state. They have to keep records. They also have to make sure that stormwater control measures are maintained within their jurisdictions, and they have to review projects for compliance. So it's quite a few things they have to do. Paul, we have files that are many years old. Some of the files I have on these communities are older than some of the staff that currently serve in the stormwater program. But we have these files, and we wanted to update them, and we're very fortunate in 2021 that we have a lot of digital tools. So Paul tried to capitalize on some of the tools we have by sending out a questionnaire to all of our communities, all 290 of them. And they were invited to answer 46 questions about their program and how it works and some of the features from the rules and options that they choose and choose not to implement. And then we wanted them to upload digital copies of their most current ordinance and their most current maps, because these have all updated through the years. So far we have a 39% response. We started this survey during COVID. So we'd like to improve that response rate, and we'll be reaching out to the community soon, especially now. Hopefully they're getting back on their feet after COVID is over. So the nice thing about this survey is as soon as the community staff hits send, that information is placed by us into a digital file that's available online for the community, our regional office staff, citizens, and anyone else who's interested is able to view these items in the digital file. So it's been a really nice tool for us as staff during COVID to have this. Okay, so why are we revising this draft model ordinance? Well, it's pretty old. It's from 1995, the one we currently have. Like I mentioned, we wanted to update the statute with the statute changes from 2012 and the rule changes from 2014. And we're always trying to improve clarity and make things easier for our various regulated communities to use. So that was another goal of our efforts with the ordinance. Here's the table of contents. So, and Paul kind of summarized the changes for you all. So in the first article, Paul updated some of the definitions and some were changed per our current rulemaking. Part of the rules review and readoption process, like I mentioned, was to increase the consistency. So, you know, if we had our coastal stormwater program, for example, using the same term as is used in the water supply watershed program, we wanted those definitions to match. So sometimes they didn't, and so we need updates. And then in the next couple articles, Paul made some minor changes to improve clarity. The biggest changes to content occurred in Article 400. So in this article, here's the ordinance right here. I know you can't see that, but in Article 400, Paul pulled in a new table. We used to have all the water supply watershed rules in their own program in separate rules. So in other words, we had a rule for water supply 2, a rule for water supply 3, a rule for water supply 4. And it's challenging for a community like Wilkes County to figure, you know, they had to go to all these different rules. So what we did to make things easier is we put all the requirements together in one table. This is the water supply watershed program. And look up what your density thresholds are allowed depending on the classification of the water supply watershed. So Paul just cut and pasted that out of our rules into this table in the ordinance for ease of use of our communities. Also, a big change was Paul added the density averaging part of the program that's required from the 2012 statute into the ordinance. Again, some more minor changes in the next articles, 500 and 600. Organizational changes throughout, especially definitions section was moved to the beginning to be more consistent with how we do our rules in DEQ. Footnotes were moved to the end of the document. Paul did a comments process and a summary. So initially, Paul prepared the ordinance and he shared it with a small group of some of our leading water supply watershed communities. They provided some comments to us, and based on those comments, we revised the draft. The final draft that Paul has created is prepared here for your review and approval today. Now, a note about the model ordinance and its role in our program. It's not required for the local governments to use our model ordinance. It's just what it says. It's a model. So a lot of the communities have different ways that they organize. They have a unified development ordinance, and they may have the same information for water supply watersheds covered in a completely different organization and fashion. But we have had communities ask us for updates to the model ordinance to assist them and making sure they're compliant with the 2019 rules. So Paul wanted me to share some resources here with you. He wanted me just to show you the website. I'm gonna hope this works. Oh, good. Okay. So in the stormwater program, just like the other parts of DEQ, we have a lot of customers we serve, and we take a lot of pride in our website because it's an easy way for us to reach out to our regulated community. So There, we have the model ordinance is already available for their review, and we've made it clear we have July 7th there, and made it clear that let them know that we're coming to you for your review and consideration of the model ordinance. And we're going to post when it's finalized, we'll post this on the website. Paul also has an email listserv for his communities. We have the opportunity for the communities to take the survey. We have all the rules available. And we have interactive maps. And then some new things that we've added are a memo and a PowerPoint that explains density averaging. And since that's an important part of our program and the changes, I'll just show you briefly one of the picture slides. Hopefully it'll load up. You never know about internet service in the Archdale building. It's always a surprise. While that's loading, I'll show you a couple other things. And then we have all these links here to assist our communities with things that they might need. Oh, it looks like this is not loaded up. All right, I'll just tell you verbally what density averaging is. Density averaging is a required component of the program for the 2012 statute. And what it does is it requires the communities to provide an option for individual. Oh, wonderful. I didn't see you there.
Yeah, sorry, just one moment. Yeah, so unfortunately, PowerPoints are not going to stop.
All right, never mind.
So,
No, that's no problem. No problem. I'll just paint a picture with words. So, what it does is it requires that local governments provide an option to landowners who have already built their property, but the amount of built upon the area that they have used is below the threshold. This could be either the upper threshold for high density, or it could be below the threshold for low density. For example, if they're in a water supply 2 and the threshold is 12%, but they only built at 5%, for example, this landowner would have the opportunity to sell the difference between 5% and the 5% he used and the 12% he was allowed, so the extra 7%, to another landowner. But it's required that the community have record keeping, that this be included in the plat with meets and bounds. It's pretty complicated, and a lot of questions have arisen about this, and we've actually spent a lot of time working with our general counsel to try to discern exactly how to implement everything that's in the general statute of 2012. So that's PowerPoint has been very helpful to the communities because there's some nice diagrams of how it can work and what are the allowable ways to use this option for a landowner, what are the not allowable ways, what are the record keeping requirements for these communities with regard to density averaging. So, so this is a nice resource that we've worked hard to provide. And Paul has also created a fact sheet about other activities that are allowed and not allowed in water supply watersheds. So other things like landfills or wastewater treatment facilities, for example. So he's provided that as well. Anyway, I'm sorry I don't have a slide that succinctly states what we're asking, but what we are asking is for approval of this model ordinance to be used as a resource for our local governments to implement a water supply watershed program. And I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. So we have agenda items 3 and 4. This basically is presented.
That's correct. I just combined.
One, which is all under the title number 4.
That's correct. I apologize for the confusion about that too.
By staff as well. let me ask you, when you have these following back model program, we did not begin someone asked one model program. So your knowledge and getting from the government ratio with different communities. Sometimes they don't actually involve in
Yes. I wish Paul were here to answer that question. I know he did have some interactions with Richard Wilson about the ordinance, and I don't know, I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly the extent of Richard's involvement, but he was involved with the original model ordinance. The updates we made are pretty much to address these changes to rules and statute and definitions, a little bit of organization. That I agree that would be very ideal to have someone from the School of Governments look at it.
would encourage both divisions to make better standard practice. Originally, School of Government played a role in drafting.
Good suggestion.
Any questions or comments? It's very thorough message. So if we have a motion to approve. And Dr. Eric, I was just trying to wrap my head off the density and everything. Covered out on that with it. So they're like cheap trade. Is it?
Yes. Yes. And the two parties involved, they negotiate, the price. But there's some requirements that have to be met, surveying the lots. The seller has to be, has to put deed restrictions on his property that he or she is no longer going to use the rest of the built upon area allocation on that property. There's also some restrictions. If you're in a critical area, you can't buy credits from someone who's in the balance of watershed, for example, because we're trying harder to protect the critical area. So selling from the balance of, all right, let's see, it gets confusing. So if you're in the critical area, you can sell credits from the balance, but you can't buy credits from the balance. You can only buy credits from within the critical area. So the slideshow does a nice job answering many questions that we've received from the communities. So yeah, I encourage you to look at that if you get a chance.
Is there like that's something in another part of the country, or did y'all come up with this trade?
Well, the legislature came up with this for us, so I'm not sure how they came up with it. It's a good question. It was our understanding that this needed to be approved at the committee level and did not need to go to the commission level. I should have been more clear about that.
I will ask quickly about the survey. So about 39% of respondents, so it was a voluntary response.
Well, no, it's a challenge with the community. So we've said we want you to respond. Of course, we don't have anything in rules that says anytime we feel like doing a survey, you have to respond. But we have said if you don't respond, it would definitely put you at a higher priority for us to conduct an audit. So so that, when Paul sends out a reminder saying that, we tend to get a lot of a lot more kind of flow in, if you'll pardon the expression. I'll show you where we keep that information if it's not too slow.
If how frequent, how widespread of
Traditionally, we haven't done a lot of auditing of water supply watersheds. Paul has done 2 audits, but we haven't traditionally done a lot of auditing. Because of some of the advancements in our MS4 program, we have an audit template that we use for those communities. And, you know, we've been able to modify that same template and the same process and use that in the water supply watershed program. And here's our whole Laserfish repository where we keep all of our documents public. But here are the files on the water supply watershed program. So these are all the communities that responded. So WSCO means water supply watershed county. And then we have the first 4 letters of the county name. So here's the counties and here's the municipalities. So we have collected a lot of new and updated information digitally, but we still have a little ways to go. And we'll focus on that during the next year as well. And hopefully when we have the next annual report, we'll be able to tell you that we have a much higher participation in our survey.
Is there a motion for approval or decision?
Madam Chair, John McAdams, I move approval of this water supply watershed protection draft or model.
A second. Second. Commissioner Bond. Commissioner McDaniel's motion. Any further discussion? Question? Calling the roll. Commissioner Carter.
Aye.
Commissioner Davis.
Aye.
Commissioner McAdams.
Aye.
Commissioner Monas. Aye. Commissioner and Vice Chair. Aye. Motion carries. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Clark. That ends our action items. We have numeral 3 on our agenda. It's just a refresher about what water quality topics will be before the EMC tomorrow. And then numeral 4, information items on our agenda. 2 information items. First one being the 2021 report on minor modifications to approved major variance. This is not scheduled for a presentation, but Mr. Paul Wojcicki of the Division of Water Resources 401 and Buffer Permitting Branch is here in case members have any questions about it.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Deerick. As you mentioned, I don't have any formal presentation for this report. The report is just to provide a few comments of context, and I'll just be here if there's any questions. This report is a condition of the delegation of the modifications to approved major variances to the state riparian buffer rules. And this condition was a part of this committee's decision in February of 2003. And so part of the condition was that if the division were to approve any minor modifications to approved major variances, those modifications would be reported back to this committee on a periodic basis. And so that's the purpose of this report here. As you can see in the report, there's only one minor modification that was issued for this reporting cycle, and that was to Johnson County landfill for a administrative change to a mitigation provider. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Not hearing any, but thank you for being here.
Certainly, you're very welcome.
Second and final information item is a report status for 2021 on the Falls Lake nutrient strategy. Subdivision Water Resources 9-point source plan.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Deerhag, members of the committee. Again, I'm John Heisman. I'm with the Non-Point Source Planning Branch here at the Division of Water Resources, and I come before you today with an information item presenting an overview of the 2021 status report for the Falls Lake Nutrient Management Strategy. This is the second time we are bringing forward this report. It's a 5-year report, so the last time we brought it before the committee was back in 2016. Since it's been a while, I thought I'd just start off just giving a little bit of background just to kind of reorient everybody with the Falls Lake watershed. This is a map of the watershed. Falls Lake is a 770 square mile watershed located in the upper Neuse River Basin. Sorry, okay. The lake itself serves as the primary drinking water source for the city of Raleigh and surrounding communities, serving over 450,000 residents. The watershed is comprised of 6 counties and 8 municipalities that are listed here. As I talk through the strategy, I'll refer to the upper watershed and the lower watershed, the upper lake, lower lake, and just to kind of help orient you, when you look at this map, the upper watershed is the area shaded in green that drains to the upper lake located above NC 50, which essentially bisects the lake in half. The lower watershed is the area shaded in brown, draining to the lower lake below NC 50. The red outline along the upper portion of the lake represents the 2018 integrated report indicating the chlorophyll A exceedance in that part of the lake. Originally, the lake was added to the 2008 303D list for chlorophyll A impairment, and we had a management strategy in place to reduce nutrient inputs into the lake to achieve the chlorophyll A standard and address the chlorophyll A standard exceedances. The rules went into effect back in January 2011, calling for reductions from both point and non-point sources, and is implemented through a stage adaptive implementation process. Stage 1 of the rules lasted 10 years. Originally was called for to last 10 years between 2011 and 2021, calling for a 20% reduction in nitrogen load, 40% reduction in phosphorus throughout the watershed to achieve the standard in that lower lake area below NC 50. Stage 2 would go an additional 15 years through 2036, calling for the full reductions throughout the watershed of 40% nitrogen and 77% phosphorus to achieve the standard, the chlorophyll A standard lake-wide by 2041. As you know, there was session law passed in 2016 that extended the implementation of stage 1 until the Falls Lake rules are readopted. And along with that legislation, there was the formation of the UNC Policy Collaboratory that first started with their study on Jordan Lake, which has since concluded. They've transitioned to Falls Lake. They provided their first interim report on their research back in December of last year, and their final report is due by 2023, and that will feed in the recommendations into the rules readoption process called for under legislation to begin by 2024. So with the rules now 10 years being implemented, we recognize in the strategy the inherent uncertainty of the underpinning models for any management strategy, recognize the large reductions called for in Falls Lake and the long-term reduction proposed over 30 years. We recognize in the purpose and scope rule that it would be useful to come back and report to the EMC every 5 years on a series of things to kind of see how the lake is doing, how implementation is going, how the lake's responding, and provide updates on understanding of technological and scientific advancements for nutrient reductions that can be implemented. And then, of course, this would help inform any recommendations for the adaptive management and implementation of the strategy. So with that in mind, the Falls Lake status report is basically broken down to 3 main sections. There's a section about the rule implementation status, a section about the water quality progress, both in the lake and watershed trends, looking at changes in nutrient loading to the lake, and evaluating the chlorophyll A standard in the lake itself. With that, we provide an overview of the integrated report summary and provide additional analysis that was performed by the UNRBA, the Upper Neuse River Basin Association, which also helps inform the process. The third section is the state of knowledge section, again, that addresses advances in scientific knowledge and control technology. Excuse me, and a new addition this year is an overview summary of the UNRBA special studies that they conducted as part of a special monitoring project that they conducted. And along with that, we provide an overview summary of the interim research being done by the collaboratory for the Falls Lake study. And I do want to highlight that part of the requirement of developing this report is that we work and consider information from stakeholders in the watershed. And we did that, and we provided a draft of this back in March to stakeholders and received a set of comments from the UNRBA that were very helpful and constructive, and we worked very closely with them to resolve their concerns at the time. So I'll just kind of jump in to give the implementation status update overview that's included in the report. And I'm happy to report, like, one of the successes of the implementation of the Falls Lake rules is the great reductions being achieved by the wastewater treatment plants in the watershed. There are 3 major wastewater treatment plants located in the Upper Falls watershed. It's the North Durham plant, the Hillsborough plant, and the South Granville Watershed and Sewer Authority plant, Sigwassa. And under the rules, they were required to be meeting their stage 1 allocations by 2016, and which they did. And they actually are now, with additional optimization and reduction technology, are currently achieving a combined reduction of 57% nitrogen reduction relative to the 2006 baseline. So that reduction is actually below not just their stage 1 allocation, but their current stage 2 allocation, which is based on a 40% reduction. Likewise, these 3 plants are also doing a very good job at overperforming, getting reductions in phosphorus discharge, where again, by 2016, they were meeting their stage 1 phosphorus allocations. And with additional reductions, they're now achieving a combined reduction of 73% phosphorus load in 2019 relative to the 2006 baseline. I do want to highlight, this is a great success and it should be celebrated, but it's also important to recognize that of these 3 plants, they have a permitted flow combined of about 30 MGD, and combined they're currently operating all about half that amount. So it's important just to recognize that as this urbanizing watershed continues to grow in population, as more residents move in, as flow increases, it'll become increasingly challenging for both economically and operationally for them to continue to achieve these big reductions, but they're doing a great job right now. They're currently the 3 plants, like Durham is at about half of their permanent flow. The Hillsborough and Sigwassa are a little bit below half of their permitted flow. Combined, the 3 plants I think have a combined of 30 MGD. I think Durham's around 20 MGD. I think Hillsborough's around 3, and I believe Sigwassa's like 5.5. So again, just recognizing as growth continues in the watershed, as that flow continues, it's going to take more technology, more treatment to continue to maintain those reductions, but they're doing a great job. Transitioning from point sources to non-point sources, under the ag rule, we get annual reports from the ag community on how well they're doing in estimating their reductions in nitrogen loss. And they have also reported significant reductions in nitrogen loss in the watershed, reporting in their 2020 report, which covers crop year 2018, achieving a 77% reduction in nitrogen loss. And it's important to recognize these are estimates for agriculture, less certain than our point source estimates, but we have been tracking this since implementation of the rule, and it is, these reductions in large part, Falls watershed has seen significant reductions in agricultural land itself. Since the baseline period of 2006 through 2018, we started out with around 55,000 acres of agricultural land, which a large part of that's pasture, seeing about a 50% reduction in agricultural land that's in production in the Falls watershed. So between that loss of ag land, reduction in nitrogen application rates, and implementing BMPs, mostly buffers, they've seen significant reductions reported under the rule. Sure, go ahead.
Many people mourn the loss of agricultural land, but as land is taken out of agricultural use and put into urban, does that in itself reduce the nitrogen levels in the streams?
It should. The way our rules are set up, and I was just going to get into the stormwater, is like when things are going to development, we have nutrient targets that development then has to meet. And those targets are based on those overall 40 and 77% reduction goals, assuming that developed land is coming from a composite of forested land and agricultural land. Now, the one thing that's important is since in the Falls watershed, there's a lot more forest than there is agricultural land. So when you think about things going into development, there's a lot of forest land going to development. And obviously that forest land has a pretty low export rate. But there, if agriculture is going in, it should be theoretically getting a reduction by meeting those targets. And that's a great segue to this next thing. So we recognize that we have stormwater requirements for new development. All of the local governments in the watershed have been implementing their stormwater program since 2012. They have to meet these development nutrient export requirements of 2.2 pounds per acre per year nitrogen, 0.33 pounds per acre per year for phosphorus. And they do that by implementing stormwater control measures, SCMs on site. After they meet a minimum reduction on site, they can also go and pay for nutrient offset payments off site, either through the Division of Mitigation Services or private banks. I want to highlight that state and federal entities in the watershed also have similar stormwater requirements that they're implementing. And as of December 2020, there has been approximately 341 nitrogen transactions for nutrient offsets, totaling 115,000 pounds of nitrogen being offset, and 329 phosphorus transactions, totaling around 16,000 pounds of phosphorus. And these nutrient offsets are primarily done, again, through DMS and private banks through the implementation of buffer restoration projects to offset those loads. Along with new development stormwater requirements, there's existing development requirements calling for reductions from existing developed lands that the local governments have to meet. The local governments all completed inventories back in 2013 of their existing developed lands and assessed reduction opportunities. Since 2013, the division has been working closely with the stakeholders and the UNRBA on expanding the toolbox of available nutrient reducing practices that they could use towards meeting the requirements under the rule. More recently, back in January, we completed the development of the nutrient credit catalog that's posted to our website. That's kind of a one-stop shop listing of all the approved nutrient credit practices for all the rules under the management strategy, including existing development, that provide the design criteria and reduction assignments for those practices. And we also finalized the model program that the local governments can use to develop their local implementation programs. And that model program was brought before the EMC and approved back in January 2021. Along with that, the UNRBA has been working very closely with the division, NGOs, and other stakeholders in developing what they call this innovative interim alternative implementation approach, the IAIA. And this approach appears to have a lot of great promise. They just wrapped up approval of with their board of the program and submitted it to the division for review. But this essentially combines, it's a group compliance approach for meeting existing development, where they combine the reduction needs from wastewater and existing development and create an investment-based approach that gets away from the pounds accounting side and creates an annual dollar commitment on implementing practices. So it gets away from pounds accounting and gets more towards implementing practices. And that is a group compliance approach that the 12 members of the UNRBA intend to implement, and they have submitted it to DWR for review as programs for both local and joint programs were due to the division this month under the rules. So we're currently reviewing that final program, but they kept us very close in the loop as they developed it, and that showed a lot of promise. So I wanted to transition from the implementation aspect to the water quality aspect that we cover in the report. And the division looked at loading analysis a couple of different ways for the watershed to look at changes in loading since the rules have been in place. And we estimated loading from those 5 upper major tributaries that are shown in beige here on the map. And those are the Eno, Little River, Platte, Napa Reeds, and Ellerby Creek. Using the DWR's ambient monitoring stations in each of those tributaries and USGS flow gauge stations. And we did analysis doing two different methods. One was using LODES, which uses the flows and concentrations to create a regression curve to fill in areas where we don't have data to create raw estimated loads from those tributaries to the lake. And then recognizing that flow plays a huge role in those LODES numbers, we also use this WRTDS, which is this weighted regression time discharge and season method that creates flow normalized loads. And what that does is that allows you to look at changes in loading to the lake that takes out that year-to-year variability of flow and gives you a better idea of the impact that management aspects may be having on loading to the lake. So this is the LODES results for nitrogen. And I know there's a lot of stuff going on here, so I'll try to orient you, but we basically are looking at the combined loading and flow stacked for those 5 tributaries, those 5 upper tributaries. The different tributaries are color-coded on the bottom of this graph there, and you can see that the top bar graph is the nitrogen loading in pounds combined from those tributaries, and the bottom is the annual flow. And the really interesting thing here to look at is, not surprisingly, with LODES, load closely tracks those trends in flow. As you can see, the drier years see lower loads, the wetter years see higher loads. And even though we've seen successful implementation of the stage 1 rules, because we're experiencing a lot of wetter years in these most recent years, you'll see in that top bar graph, we're estimating that overall with the raw load, we're estimating a 37% increase in nitrogen loading. And that's keeping in mind that we're seeing a greater than 100% increase in flow. So while it is going up in raw loading, it's less than half what the flow is going up. So that indicates to us that while loading under LODES is heavily influenced by flow, that management actions are having an impact. Along those lines, looking at phosphorus, we also see changes there, but we're actually seeing a decrease in phosphorus estimated load of about 17%. And there, we really think that a large driver in that is that huge overperformance by the wastewater dischargers of getting that 73% phosphorus reduction in those watersheds is largely driving that reduction here. But again, you do see a close, correlation between flow and load, again, pointing to the non-point sources as potential main contributor here. So looking at those two graphs, they're helpful to see the raw load, but it definitely highlights the fact that you want to also look at loads in a way that you can statistically remove those effects of flow to get a better idea of what other factors, management factors, might be impacting in loads. So again, we did these flow normalized load calculations using that WRTDS to remove the effects of that year-to-year variability of flow. Looking at that same time period of 2006 to 2019, this approach, when you take out the variability of flow, we saw downward trends in phosphorus with a combined reduction of 52% load reduction in all the 5 upper watersheds combined. We saw downward trends in total nitrogen in 3 of the upper 5 watersheds, and those were the 3 watersheds that had a point source. And we saw an upward trend in 2 of the watersheds, and those were the 2 that don't have point sources but were dominated by non-point sources loading to their streams. So the story there is looking at these flow normalized loads. Tributaries with point sources experience decreases in loading. Tributaries with dominated by non-point sources tended to see increases in loading. So that's like the loading side of things, but then there's the analysis that DW does. We conduct monitoring in the lake itself for chlorophyll A at 12 different stations to go towards that biannual integrated report to keep with the compliance of the Clean Water Act to evaluate progress towards meeting the chlorophyll A standard in the lake. And again, stage 1 is about meeting it in the lower lake below NC 50. Stage 2, which is still to come, would be about meeting in the upper lake. As you can see, we're showing the integrated report chlorophyll A standard assessments for 2014, 2016, and 2018. And the red indicates you're not meeting the criteria for chlorophyll A. The blue indicates meeting the criteria, and gray is where the data is inconclusive. And while you don't really want to compare year to year because there have been changes in methodology and sources of data, we just thought it was helpful to kind of look at the past 3 integrated reports and show that while there are a couple of arms that are inconclusive in the lower lake, for the most part, most of the lower lake, as of the 2018 integrated report, is meeting the chlorophyll A standard. Of course, the upper lake that's draining those 5 upper watersheds which is shallower and wider is still experiencing chlorophyll A standards exceedances. And in general, we have some other information in the report that shows those standard exceedances tend to trail off as you work down the lake, with the higher exceedances being the upper lake. And as you work down to the narrower, deeper parts of the lake, it becomes less. But the main takeaway there is that most of the lower lake is currently meeting the chlorophyll A standard for under stage 1. In addition to DWR's analysis, the UNRVA had a special monitoring project that they invested over $3 million in, where they were collecting samples from stations monthly between 2014 and 2018 at 38 tributary stations throughout the watershed that are shown on this map. 18 of those were on the tributaries leading right into the lake throughout the lake, and the other 20 were helped with jurisdictional loading estimates. All of this data that they are collecting will help fill gaps and support the supplemental lake model that they're developing. The UNRVA is working on several models for re-examining the Falls Lake rules, creating a new warmth model for the watershed, a new warmth model for the lake, an EFDC model for the lake, and a statistical model. And then all of this data they're collecting will help with the calibration, validation, and modeling of the lake and support that re-examination of stage 2. They've summarized all their monitoring data in a 2019 final report. And in that report, they also did some analysis of loading that in some ways mimics and some of the work that DWR did in looking at load S, but it kind of builds upon it and looks at things in different ways where we can't draw direct comparisons, but we can look at this and it helps inform other aspects of questions for the lake. And what they did that I want to summarize here was they did this total loading estimate post baseline, looking at 2006 up through 2018 when they finished their data collection. And here, unlike DWR, where we looked at those 5 upper tributaries, they looked at all 18 tributaries since they're collecting data from those 18 tributaries. Of course, we weren't collecting data from all 18 back in 2006. So what they did was they used the original DWR lake model to come up with estimates for those 18 tributaries back in the baseline and compared those load numbers to the 2018 load estimates that they came up with their monitoring data, and also considered other things outside of just tributary loading, looking at atmospheric deposition and internal loading from lake sediments. And when they looked at this kind of holistic picture of these different sources, came up with an estimated load decrease between 2006 and 2018 of a 13% reduction in nitrogen and 15% reduction in phosphorus loading. In addition to that, they did this really interesting look where they looked at the post-impoundment historical loading of the lake, where they looked back at water quality data that was collected as early as 1983, which is right after the lake was impounded, through 2018. And of course, since back in 1983, there was only data being collected on 3 tributaries where there were point sources. So there's 3 tributaries to compare. And they used this method using the generalized additive model, GAM, that can look at large swaths of historical data to look at the reductions in loading over time, and actually estimated loading decreases since that impoundment of 60% nitrogen and 90% phosphorus, which are huge numbers over that long period of time. But it's not entirely unexpected when you think about that initial spike in nutrient loads and when you're impounding the river to the lake and kind of submerging all that vegetation and then having the natural processes over time and the phosphate ban and those other subsequent things happening with the noose rule. So when you're looking at longer range of time, looking at the impoundment, you see these reductions. And I think these two kind of help paint a picture that, again, while you can't directly compare them to DWR's analysis, it helps give us an idea of what's been going on in the lake, where things are going, and it points towards things all moving in a positive direction. So that's kind of a quick overview of the water quality aspect. And I'll just touch on this last part. I'm not going to go into much detail about these, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, where the third major part of the report is this state of knowledge section. And this state of knowledge section is addressed in the rule itself, where the falls rule lists out different subject areas to report on each 5-year report. And that includes things like, the state of wastewater treatment technology, advancements in stormwater treatment technology, use of nutrient offsets, programmatic measures, land application, looking at atmospheric deposition trends, and then summarizing studies about nutrients from groundwater and on-site systems, kind of taking a look at where things are in terms of our understanding of those things and those treatment technologies and where they're going. In addition to addressing those things in the report this time around, we also provide summaries of the UNRBA special studies and the UNC collaboratory studies that they provide their interim report on back in December. Again, I wasn't gonna get into great detail, but I did want to highlight the work that they are doing, because there has been a lot of great work done by the UNRBA and the collaboratory, and want to point out that they're working very closely with each other. And these special studies and the collaboratory studies will greatly help with the remodeling of Falls Lake and inform the rules readoption process. The collaboratory currently has these 9 projects that they've been, research projects that are being done, that they provided interim updates on that we summarize. And they were kind of broken down into 3 different categories of looking at things addressing watershed loading, lake behavior, and modeling and management. And that involves everything from looking at high and low flow observational studies, continuing research on the influence of on-site wastewater in the watershed, then looking at things like lake behavior, about the cyanotoxin presence and year-round dynamics in the lake, quantifying nutrient sediment processes, and just looking at the importance of an impoundment ecosystems to the global organic carbon cycling. Some other modeling and management aspects that they're looking at is the collaboratory will be conducting a review of the UNRBA's modeling work. They're also looking at doing surveys and working with the local governments about getting a better understanding about developing a revenue shed for paying for nutrient management. And there's some stormwater research going on with NC State to look at different Green Street retrofits that can help local governments meet their requirements. So these are the 9 projects that they're currently working on that they provided an interim update in that 2020 interim report. And then these are the 8 special studies conducted by the UNRBA that they conducted as part of their monitoring project. Again, that these all go towards helping develop a better understanding of the biological, geological processing in the lake, kind of help fill in some gaps about our understanding and uncertainties and the underpinning modeling that went into the original management strategies, by looking at things like storm event sampling and high flow sampling to get a better regime of water quality results from the lake that will input into their modeling, looking at creating a bathymetry map, depth map of the lake and sediment map of the lake, and looking at sediment quality and internal nutrient loading and light extinction data. And they performed an evaluation of all the different models that have been developed for the lake and helped inform them in choosing their models moving forward. And I think the real important thing is that they've been keeping DWR very closely tied in the loop with their work with the monitoring, the modeling effort that's underway now. We're working closely with them so we understand each step of the process as they're developing their modeling. And again, there's a close collaboration between the UNRBA and the UNC collaboratory as well. So in summary, I just want to highlight that all the regulated sources are successfully implementing their stage 1 requirements under the Falls rules. And as I showed in the maps earlier, as of the 2018 integrated report, most of the lower lake is meeting the chlorophyll A standard, meeting that stage 1 goal. Of course, looking at the loading analysis, the DWR load analysis did have mixed results, with flow normalized loads suggesting management actions are in fact having an impact, and highlighting that point source dominated stream loads are improving, where non-point source dominated stream loads not so much. But those are things that we'll have to keep an eye on. The UNRBA load analysis was very different than DWR's and not comparable, but it does help answer other questions and kind of give us some big picture ideas about holistic reductions to the lake and historical reductions since the impoundment. And those are useful insights to have. As I mentioned earlier, the UNRBA and the UNC collaboratory efforts are ongoing, and both parties, all the work that they're doing will greatly inform the upcoming rules readoption process. That UNRBA monitoring project and their special studies was a large commitment on the part of those local governments, both financially and from a resource perspective. And that additional data is going to go towards having a much more robust model for the watershed and the lake this time around. And their initial findings highlight the importance of lake sediment loading and atmospheric deposition, and really just kind of help highlight the fact that nutrient inputs into the lake outside of just regular tributary inputs are important to consider as we move forward. And those collaboratory studies have helped and will help improve our understanding of the lake and its management and behavior. And as I mentioned, there's some cyanotaxin studies and others that really have a health-related focus. So it kind of gives us a well-rounded look on the current status of the lake and will help inform the recommendations for that as well. In terms of next steps, the UNRBA remodeling project is scheduled to wrap up at the end of 2023. Likewise, the UNC Collaboratory's final Falls Lake report is also due in 2023. We will get interim reports from them between now and then each December. And the EMC rules readoption process, as called for under the legislation, is scheduled to begin in 2024. And then, of course, we have these ongoing Falls 5-year reports. And the next 5-year report will be due in 2025 and capture all of this ongoing work that will be completed at that time. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions about the report or anything related to Falls Lake at all.
Thank you. Over, but since for the last meeting, okay, this is really important information. Been done in the last 5 years. Lead up to this report, very useful on the report was called for. Questions?
Thank you for the presentation. That was really well done and clearly explained, and appreciate all the work that's going into this. I had a question. When you showed up those really good graphs of the year by year, and you see how much it varied, and then 2006 is the baseline year. I wanted to get a sense from you about how do we feel about 2006 as the baseline year in relation to the environmental improvements that we need to achieve, and how do you think about those things relating to each other?
It's tough because back when the original modeling was done, so we had collected data from starting in 2004, 5, 6, and 7. And of course, there were some big drought years around that time. And ultimately that, not making excuses, but we were under a legislative mandate about getting the rules adopted. That was the set of data we had. And 2006 was the most normal year out of those years. So that was selected through the stakeholder process with input using 2006. It made the most sense with the information that we had then, and that's why we measure all reductions relative to that. But that's a valid point that comes up a lot where people point to that, since it was surrounded by some severe drought years, and there could be lingering effects from that. I think part of the rules reexamination and the remodeling, of course, looking at something 15 years later, reduction numbers are going to be different. And whether it's about still comparing to the 2006 baseline or picking some other point that makes more sense now that we have more information, I think that's going to be an important discussion that's going to happen for that process.
Makes sense, because it seems like with the targets that we have, most of the stakeholders have done a great job of, aiming towards those targets. And then the only worry I had is that the right target?
Right, and I think that's going to be a pretty detailed discussion at the time, because people want to get credit for what they've done relative to that target, and then the discussion of whether that target makes sense based on that year. So I think we're going to have the benefit of a lot more data, a lot more analysis, the UNC work. I think whether a new baseline is used is going to be a critical discussion for readoption.
Commissioner Carter or Commissioner Davis, do you have any questions?
No, I have none. Thank you.
Commissioner McAdams, do you have anything?
No, thank you, but, Sean, congratulations on excellent work.
I have a few questions. So the general impression I got in the report, and tell me if I'm incorrect, please, but that South Granville and Hillsborough proceeded pretty soon after the 2011. Proceeded pretty quickly to install, purchase and install biological technology. Was also a 2012 planning document, right around that.
Yes, yes.
Reading the report, I get the impression, please tell me if I'm wrong, but it appears Durham has tried to improve existing technology and not invested in new technology. Am I correct there?
Well, they did. I know that Durham is one of the three. Durham has been implementing some of that Animox treatment, like using different bacteria, which we kind of view as one of the more kind of innovative, approaches, like a new treatment approach. So they have been, like, I think as part of their
Placing tanks, rebuilding.
right. I mean, they had a pretty big upgrade project that was kind of coming online right when we were, adopting the rules and had a long-term plan for that. And I think a lot of folks were really focused on the stage one reduction goals and figuring out ways they could optimize their current treatment, and somewhat hesitant to, this is, I guess I should caution that this is my professional judgment, just cautioning against, doing too much towards the stage two, recognizing that stage two might be revisited at some point. But so it was mainly about optimizing current technologies to the greatest extent they could, and I've done a lot of good with that. But I do think that there has been some new aspects to their upgrades as well. Again, looking at some of these different bacteria that they're using. I think there's some with the phosphorus treatment. There's been some of that sideline phosphorus reductions as well, and they've been looking at different, I think, water reuse aspects as well, but on a smaller scale.
South Granville and the Hillsborough investments that paid off, they're worth it.
I mean, in my opinion, they're worth it, and they're performing well. They're doing great, and I know Hillsborough is often cited as a good example of well done management. I mean, I think all three have done really well. I just know that Hillsborough has been like in the news about some of their work over there, and then South Granville Water and Sewer Authority. I know that early on under other rules, they had some challenges, but they really stepped up under the Falls rules and implementing upgrades and optimizing things. And, they all seem to be doing a very good job and reaping the rewards of their investments.
What's the estimate of the overall capacity in use right now? Have there been any forecasting?
Not that I'm aware of. That's something that I can certainly look into with our NPDS folks, but I'm not aware of any discussions about that.
Yes, those figures.
No, okay. And what are they addressing?
It's showing formula.
Oh, I got you. Okay. So this is the integrated report. I didn't have the bar graphs in the presentation from the report. don't think, I think they weren't in here. I think you're talking about those color coded, it's like oranges and reds and kind of shows the magnitude of the exceedances. Yes.
So I think each one of the criteria
Yes.
is 4 years. And I noticed that didn't see anything reported for Ellerby Creek, which was challenging. And then I think that the green color coding, that is increase in chlorophyll spread downstream from station 01AD.
Mhm.
So discharges were going down during the chlorophyll exceeds in that section of the
Well, so, I apologize, I don't have the maps to pull up here. I'll make sure for the presentation tomorrow, I have it in a slide in reserve, so we can pull it up. But yeah, the way those maps were set up, the warmer colors, the reds and the oranges were higher percent exceedances, and the cooler colors, the greens and the blues were lower percent exceedances. And as I was saying, in general, we had higher percent exceedances in the upper lake, and it tends to drift off as you work down the lake. But that middle of the lake area below Ellerby Creek, they do see things kind of flip flop a little bit back and forth.
even with maps that you have, you see in 2014, the central large section of the lake, the parts a little blue with an arm up.
Mhm.
But then when you move beyond that, the southern part of that reach is red.
Right. And I think part of it is like, and again, with looking at these, I thought it was helpful to kind of show the different years, but also caution against doing too much comparison across the years, just because there's different sources of data that are being used. Like in some years, we do have DWR data plus a third-party data, like the North Carolina Applied Aquatic Ecology Center at NC State submitted data. In other years, we don't have that data. So sometimes we had some things that would flip inconclusive, whereas if we had that data again, it would show as it being impaired. So I think that Lick Creek area is kind of part of what we're seeing with it going from blue to inconclusive to red is a change in the data used, because I think in 2014, from my discussions with the modelers, is we didn't actually have a station in Lick Creek. And instead, that assessment unit that included Lick Creek was tied into a station further down the stem of the lake and shown to be meeting standards. Then in 2016, I believe we did have CAE data that was located in Lick Creek, but it wasn't enough to make it conclusive. So it was data inconclusive, and that's why we see it going gray. And then in 2018, we had data again from CAE, but we had enough data to make an assessment, and you see it turning red there. So it's a little
telling us that there's a based on the data.
It is, and I probably didn't explain that well, but because of changes in the assessment units and the data availability, some of the changes you see aren't reflective of a change in the water quality itself. It is just that availability of data.
Question about atmospheric deposition. You know, that
Yes.
favorite topic. Page 73 of the report, it talks about the total inlet. Total inorganic nitrogen, that include reduced nitrogen. I'm not sure if that got.
You know what? I will double check. I thought it did, but I will double check on that. I believe it is, but I want to be 100% sure, so I will follow up on that. I knew you were going to be interested in that graph.
Next question is, about wastewater treatment discharge.
Yes.
You're talking about their loading increase and it's most likely not source. What's been happening in those two tributaries? Anything new in terms of development that may have led to rainfall for the years?
I think I did look into it because I want to get a better understanding of Flat and Little River that don't have point sources. And I do think it's largely driven by flow and, flow largely driving non-point source loads in those watersheds and them not having the benefit of reductions being achieved from point sources that are not impacted by those increases in flow. And of course, there's some interesting things going on in the Flat and Little River, depending on like where our monitoring stations are. In the Little River, we actually have the DWR monitoring station is actually above a reservoir. So you see, some impacts of how our estimate is pre that reservoir, and then what's getting out of that reservoir into the lake could be different from what our estimate is. And that's one of the things that the UNRVA highlighted in their analysis, because they looked at a Little River station that was below the reservoir. And then there is a impoundment as well in the Flat Creek Flat Creek stream as well. But I really think that in looking at things, there's no smoking gun other than the inclination that those wetter years and the absence of point sources and non-point source loads being heavily influenced by flow, I think is driving what we're seeing there.
Point out the statement of 7%, 15%, 9%.
I agree, and that's been an important point of discussion with the UNRVA and the collaboratory as they've been looking at things, because getting a better handle on that internal nutrient loading from sediments and what impact they have on chlorophyll A, considering like if you stopped all other inputs into the lake, I think it's going to be a critical piece of information that we didn't have during the original modeling of Falls Lake, and I think that'll play an important role moving forward.
That to me is a real emerging topic in the fear, it's not always leading to the same outcome. Playing a role in the so we look at it. I really think this is important area for consideration.
I agree. I'm glad that the UNRVA and the collaboratory are taking a look at that, because I think it will really help kind of fill that uncertainty.
That's basically all I had. It sounds like you're satisfied or encouraged that the flow normalized loading models, or whatever the flow normalizing routine is, it's better informing that we think it's a valid approach.
We do think that it's that WRTDS, that flow normalized load. I think it is a good approach and valid approach in talking with the modelers and giving us a better handle on management impacts to load into the lake.
Any other comments or on this topic?
Thank you.
So as we conclude today, or anything new about the future committee interests, just to say that I have been following and participating in a stakeholder work group I was recruited to be on through the CHIP. It was a CHIP that supported or CHIP endorsed personal habitat protection effort. So there's a lot of discussion about submersible vegetation restoration, and that is on our list of topics of interest. And we had an excellent presentation with Dr. Rubin as chairman, and look forward to receiving the coastal habitat protection plan update, which I think is coming in September, maybe. September and then the final budget not yet made for the north.
I think it's coming soon. I had an email traffic comment about that.
So, share today.
I had, see, I have comment, one of them I want to say was mine. But I wanted to speak a little bit about so, just for context. Last week, central office and all staff discussed this system, talking about the likelihood of tropical system at our doorstep on the way and back. And over the weekend, we had some staff follow the email traffic and some information from the OC. So we scheduled some time for meetings to be back. So where we are right now is we have staff scheduled to work with the Emergency Operations Center and our 4 coastal regional offices. A few of our current teams, but right now they are points to provide or send out and available form with situation report. So that's really where we are. I think it's normal staff bumping around over the year. Really where we are right now. Remind me for everybody about the car, but I wanted to mention that we've got staff right now.
Thank you. That tells us about the level of effort and planning that's required by this department, this division, crisis and storm events. Something that we don't hear much about, that we need to appreciate to the department division for all their efforts to help minimize those impacts of people responding once occur. Thank you for that. Yes, we had an announcement in Air Quality Committee. Excuse me. Air Quality Committee that tomorrow's meeting is a hybrid approach. I don't think I have a statement here before me about the response meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Vice Chair Lenore announced that the end of their quality committee already scheduled to be a hybrid meeting. Had been encouraged to be your person on the center. However, in the storm, their Vice Chair Lenore is strongly urging all members to attend the meeting. The meeting will take place otherwise as scheduled. That the ground floor hearing will be open. Doesn't get that much, but you can encourage everyone, including the staff, including the public, to certainly be their WebEx with him.
I think a new WebEx invitation is supposed to come out for members.
That's my understanding.
Commissioner Davis, are you still online? Have you received anything?
I have not,
But you are already signed up.
yeah, I mean, I received it, Lois sent it to me previously.
And just to pass my understanding is that if a member appears on the general attendance list, that can switch them over to a panel as well.
Okay. Because I don't think unless it's come in the last little bit, I don't think I've received my invitation yet. I saw the general announcement a week or so ago and just sort of heard it since I was going to do. Okay. Council, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
I don't. Like.
No other comments. Thank you for being here. Glad to see everyone in person again. If we have a safe next day or two, and this storm will be non-event for us, but it may be. Our next meeting will be in September. Thank you again for participating. Adjourn.
You got it.